Hello all. So in the last sessions we were talking about classification algorithms. We have seen four important classification algorithms. One was KNN, decision tree, knife based classifier, and in the last session we were talking about random forest. So in this session I would like to talk about another most important classification algorithm, or probably the last classification algorithm as per the syllabus, which is support vector machine. Okay, so when we have discussed about all the algorithms, we have seen all the algorithms can be used both for classification and regression, right? So out of all the algorithms, the most powerful machine learning algorithm which is widely used both for classification and regression, and when I talk about classification also, both for linear and non-linear classification as well as regression along with outlier detection, we will be using support vector machine. Okay, so support vector machine, or in general we call it as SVM. So this is one of the most popular supervised learning algorithms which is used for both regression and classification, primarily used for classification. So the main goal of SVM is actually to create the best line or the decision boundary that can actually divide the entire data into different classes. Okay, so that whenever a new data point comes, we can easily put that new data point either into class A or B, or whichever class it is perfectly applicable. So this decision line that we draw using SVM algorithm is actually called as boundary. This decision boundary is actually called as hyperplane. Okay, now SVMs are particularly effective because they focus on finding this particular maximum separating hyperplane, or the decision boundary, which is called as hyperplane. Okay, so this hyperplane is actually used for dividing the different classes in the target feature, making them robust for both binary and multi-class classification. Okay, now we will explore the support vector machine learning algorithm, its applications, and how effectively it handles both linear and non-linear as well as regression tasks. Okay, now as you can see in this particular diagram, SVM will actually choose the extreme point vectors that helps in creating the hyperplane. Okay, so as you can see in this clear diagram, so this is the maximum margin that I have drawn. This is the hyperplane that I have drawn, maximum margin hyperplane. So this is the margin, this is the hyperplane that I am drawing. Okay, now I have two classes that you can see. One class is green dot, second class is blue squares. Now I want to draw a hyperplane, or SVM actually draws a hyperplane which will clearly classify green circles with blue dots, and in main SVM will allow us to choose the nearby values in each data set before we actually draw this hyperplane, and they are called as these support vectors. Okay, so as you can see, the extreme points or vectors are actually used for creating the hyperplane which differentiates between two classes. These extreme classes are called as support vectors. Okay, and hence the name is given as support vector machine. Okay, as you can see, we have two categories which are actually classified based on the decision boundary hyperplane, or that line which is called as hyperplane. Okay, now this particular hyperplane is actually used for differentiating the classes, and hence used most probably for linear and non-linear classification. Okay, so before we actually go into depth understanding about SVM, let's see different types of SVM. So basically SVM is categorized into two types: linear SVM and non-linear SVM. Okay, so when I talk about linear SVM, it is used for linearly separable data, which we'll clearly see with an example. Okay, that is, if your data set can be classified into two classes by using a single straight line, that is called as linear class. But if you cannot linearly separate the data, okay, using a straight line, then that is called as non-linear SVM. Okay, now let's see how does SVM works. Okay, so the working of support vector machine algorithm actually can be understood by this particular example. Okay, now we have a data set with two tags, one is green, one is blue. Okay, blue squares and green dots. Okay, now the data set has these two features, x1 and x2. Let's say x1 is green dots, x2 is nothing but blue squares. Okay, now we want SVM, or we want our classifier that can classify x1 and x2 of coordinates by drawing a simple line. Okay, now as it is a 2D space, you can have multiple possibilities. Okay, you can have multiple ways in which you can draw the lines which will actually separate two different classes. Okay, now how do we choose the best fit line is very important. Okay, so here in SVM what we do is, our SVM algorithm helps to find the best fit line. Okay, so here I have two lines, one is green line, second is maroon line. Both of them are clearly separating the two classes, but I want to choose the best one such that when a new sample comes, that should perfectly fit into this particular data. Okay, so our SVM algorithm will help us find the best line or the best hyperplane or the best decision boundary line. Okay, now this best decision boundary or region is called as hyperplane, as we have already seen. Now SVM algorithm finds the best line by finding the closest point of the lines from both the classes. Okay, so as you can see, we are supposed to find the support vectors. So here this is the support vector. I draw a optimal hyperplane. Here I have these three support vectors. I draw a optimal hyperplane. Okay, now first what we do in SVM is, we will find the closest points of the lines from both the classes, that is green circle and blue circle. Now these points are actually called as support vectors, and after we find out them, we will calculate the distance between the vectors and the hyperplane, which is called as margin. As you can see, maximized margin. Okay, we will find the distance between what? The support vector and the hyperplane. Okay, now what SVM does is, the main goal of SVM is to maximize this margin. The hyperplane with maximum margin is called as the optimal hyperplane. Okay, so I have two hyperplanes here. So I will point out the nearest neighbors, or I will point out the nearest data points from each class. I will find the distance between them. The distance high, the hyperplane with maximum margin, is called as the optimal hyperplane. Okay, so when you talk about non-linear SVMs, as you can see, I can't draw a single line and separate, because if I draw a single line and separate, what will happen? Let me draw a line like this. Okay, if I draw a line like this, there are few greens and blues in this line, few greens and blues in this line. If I draw a line like this, same thing, this data is completely linear. So in this case, what we do is, okay, so to separate the data points, when I talk about data points, I have green circles and blue squares. Okay, so we need to add one more dimension, which is called as Z. For non-linear SVM, we add another dimension which is called as Z. For linear data, we have used X and Y, that's all. But for non-linear data, we will add the dimension Z, and that Z is calculated as X square plus Y square. So by adding the third dimension, the sample space now will become like this. All green circles would be separated from blue triangles or blue squares or whatever it is. Now it is very easy for us to draw the hyperplane. So just understand that if you have nonlinear data, our SVM will introduce nonlinearity, remove nonlinearity by adding the third dimension and calculating the coordinates of the third dimension such that the data would be placed like this. Now I can draw a line or the best hyperplane which will actually separate the green circles with blue triangles. Okay, since we are in 3D space, it is looking like a plane parallel to the x-axis. So if we convert it into 2D space with z is equal to 1, then it will become a model like this. Okay, so you can also go for this, you can also go for that particular method. Okay, so we get a circumference of radius 1 in case of nonlinear data. Okay, now let us understand this clearly with an example. Consider email classification. Okay, spam classification. Number of spam words, we call it as F1. Frequency of specific keywords, we call it as F2. Length of the email, we call it as feature F3. Other metrics, if you have, we can also add them, which would be other features. So we have two labels here for email classification. One is spam, the other one is not spam. Okay, so during training, we input the features and labels into the SVM algorithm. The SVM will actually try to create the hyperplane and separate spam and not spam depending upon different features that we have here, that is frequency of words, length of the email and all that. After that, we will have the support vectors defining the margin. So when you get a new email, SVM will calculate its position relative to the hyperplane and predict whether the mail belongs to either spam class or a non-spam class. Okay, we collect the data, we pre-process the data, we choose the kernel function, train the SVM, identify the support vectors and optimize the hyperplane, validate the model and predict on the new data points. Okay, so we have so many advantages when we talk about SVM. One is high dimensional spaces work well for works well for clear margin of separation between two different classes, versatile with kernel functions because SVM handles both linear and non-linear data. It is robust to overfitting because even if you have high dimensions, it is very clearly performing well. It can be used effectively for both regression and classification tasks. Disadvantage, not ideal for too big large data sets, computationally expensive because for each complex function you have to apply kernels and then find it. Requires careful selection of kernel and parameters, less effective with overlapping classes. You can use SVM in different applications in healthcare where you want to predict cancer, yes or no. Okay, classifying genes data in genomics, finance, fraud detection, credit scoring, spam filtering, handwritten image detection, face detection. So there are so many applications where you can use your support vector machines. Thank you.